Okay, do you guys still see the front screen?
Yep.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us for our virtual presentation. My name is Michael Hartshorne from Princeton Hydro. I'm a project manager and an aquatic ecologist. I'm here with my colleagues Emily and Cory. If you could please introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Emily Bjorhus, a wetland ecologist and permitting specialist, Princeton Hydro.
And I'm Cory Speroff, and I'm a landscape designer with Princeton Hydro.
Great, thanks Emily and Cory. We're here today to present to you virtually the Carversville Farm Foundation Stream, Floodplain, and Multifunctional Riparian Buffer Restoration Project. So thank you for joining, and we really look forward to this presentation. I would like to provide a brief overview for the presentation, discuss the background and the history of Carversville Farm Foundation, and also of Princeton Hydro's involvement with the farm. Moving forward, we'll start to discuss a stream and watershed assessment that Princeton Hydro conducted for the foundation in 2015 and 2016, and discuss how this information led towards the application for and receipt of a Pennsylvania Growing Greener grant, which was utilized to fund the stream, floodplain, and riparian zone restoration plan. And we'll talk about the engineering, the permitting, the implications for this restoration, and then also discuss the implementation project that was conducted under this grant. And finally, we'll discuss some ideas that we have as a group for future funding and implementation to further improve the creek at Carversville Farm. And I will say, as we go through this presentation, we may say Carversville Farm Foundation or CFF interchangeably. So the Carversville Farm Foundation, shown here on the left via a historical satellite image, was historically a silviculture operation, which means a tree farm. So it was a pretty standard tree farm. You see rows and rows of monoculture trees. Typically, from an ecological perspective, not much diversity, a pretty boring site. In 2014, the Carversville Farm Foundation was formed by the purchase of this property. The Carversville Farm Foundation is a nonprofit 501c3 organization located in Sulbury Township, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And we're here in the Delaware River watershed, and the Paunacussing Creek runs through the property. The objectives of CFF and their mission statement is to produce fresh, sustainable food for the local community, but also for those organizations that aren't able to have their dietary needs met, especially groups in the inner cities where there may be folks living in food deserts or otherwise don't really have access to this type of high quality vegetables and free range meat. In addition to providing sustainable organic foods, one of the core tenets of the Carversville Farm Foundation is to produce this food in a manner that's environmentally sensitive. So Carversville Farm Foundation is very cognizant and aware of the potential impacts of standard agriculture on the soils, the water resources, the plants, and the animals. Part of their mission is to improve those resources, looking towards things like improving water infiltration, reducing stormwater runoff, building up a nice, organic, rich, diverse soil column. And all of this leads to a better plant community and ultimately a better biota for the land. And finally, the mission of Carversville Farm Foundation aligns perfectly with that of Princeton Hydro, where we aim to improve our communities and our ecosystems for the better. Just a couple photographs of Carversville's work and the results of that work. Ultimately, you see here they're delivering some fresh organic food to some of their partner organizations, which include the Broad Street Ministry, Coalition Against Hunger, Face to Face, other inner city Philadelphia groups, and they're also aligned with the Bucks County Audubon Society. Moving on, I briefly mentioned Princeton Hydro's initial work with the foundation. We were actually contacted by Carversville Farm shortly after their formation in 2014, and they really wanted to understand the creek that runs through their property and how the water quality is, how the riparian conditions are, how the biota is surrounding the stream, and any impairments that might be present. From that information, we worked with the Carversville Farm Foundation to help them work more sustainably with those natural features and to recommend restorative projects that could improve the Paunacussing Creek and ultimately improve their farming operations. And in many farms in this region in Northeast Pennsylvania, but also throughout the state, there's many common ecological impairments associated with stream corridors. And we see these in many agricultural settings, whether it's in the Delaware River watershed or also the Susquehanna and the Schuylkill watershed. And my colleague Emily will discuss what some of these common impairments are and how they relate to Carversville Farm in this next slide.
Okay, so some of the common stream impairments that we'll often see in agricultural settings include a reduced riparian buffer, floodplain disconnection, and historic sediment transport. We'll often see head cuts with erosion. So I'm going to go through all of those impairments here. Here we have pictured an image of an agricultural field that is near some of our restoration projects that we'll get to later, and the riparian buffer adjacent to the stream. So the trees that you see on the left-hand side of the figure, there's a stream there, and then in front of it you have a meadow, and then to the right, an ag field. So when you think about the historic setting of an agricultural field, previously the land use could have been forest, it could have been meadow, and when you convert the land use of those areas from that of forest or meadow to an agricultural setting, you're changing the water system in the environment. And when you have an area where you're frequently tilling soil, sometimes right up to a stream edge, you're increasing the potential for that soil to be transported offsite, either through erosion with water or wind. So by having a riparian buffer between the stream and your agricultural lands, you're improving the amount of trees and vegetation that can intercept that water and the soils that are being transported. So this is actually a picture, like I said, of at Carversville. As Mike mentioned, they're committed to sustainable farming practices. So before we even came in, they had already stopped producing their crops right up to the edge of the stream, which is why you see this meadow buffer between the stream corridor and the ag field. And but a lot of farms that we'll see or that are in the area, they do have production right up to the stream edge. And again, that reduces the sediments that can be transported into the stream. And it also increases the amount of runoff and the amount of water that's entering the stream. So you have extra soil and extra water flowing into your waterways. It can lead to some issues. So we'll get into some of the benefits of a riparian buffer further on. Next slide. But some of the issues associated with having a reduced riparian buffer can already be seen at the site. And this is an image of the tributary to the Paunacussing that goes through Carversville. You can see in this left picture, the stream channel has a eroded incised channel where the sediment loads have been transported down the stream. You can also see that there's not a lot of vegetation along either side, so there's not a lot of vegetation that's intercepting the water. So these kind of things, they lead to stream erosion, and you can get floodplain disconnectivity, which basically means that your stream is no longer able to overtop its banks and recharge the groundwater in the adjacent area. Another thing that we see, if you can go to the next slide, at this site, it's very difficult to see here, but these red lines are meant to help, is we observed a head cut that was starting to form. Water was basically running off of the adjacent agricultural field and flowing into the stream, and it was causing an erosional gully to form along the stream channel. This is not a picture of Carversville. I just wanted to bring this into the slideshow just to show you an example of how bad this can get. And I think this image really well shows the amount of sediment that is being removed from these agricultural fields and transported with the water into the stream. So Mike's going to get into, getting a lot of sediment and these flashy flows from high runoff volumes. They impact our stream biota and fish that live in our streams.
Thank you, Emily. That was an excellent summary of some of the conditions at Carversville and also other local farms. Ultimately, those changes in the lands adjacent to stream channels and the riparian corridors lead to those changes to the stream channels themselves, evidenced by the photos and the discussion by Emily of incised stream channels where the flashy flows lead to downcutting and disconnection of the stream from the floodplain. So ultimately, how do those processes affect the biota of the system? In this system and in many agricultural systems, this increased sediment loading, both from overland runoff and also stream bank and bed erosion, can lead to increased substrate embeddedness. What that means simply is the interstitial spaces in the rock substrate of the stream become filled in with fine sediments. And those small spaces are the home of one of the bases of the food web in a stream system, which are the benthic macroinvertebrates, which ultimately form the food for the fishery. So what we'll see in impaired systems will be increased embeddedness and subsequently reduced macroinvertebrate richness and also diversity, with more of a predominance of pollution-tolerant species. Of course, also with those sediments comes increased nutrients in the way of nitrogen and phosphorus, which can lead to the eutrophication or the increased algal growth and productivity of those systems. Oftentimes, these processes are combined with a reduced riparian cover, so the trees are simply removed from the sides of the streams, as many of these farms produce, all the way up to the stream edge. That leads to reductions in organic matter input. There's less leaf fall that would enter the stream channel. But also, those trees provide stabilization of the banks. They would intercept sediment deposition from overland sources. And then finally, they provide a cover that keeps the water from getting too hot. And what we'll see with many of these riparian areas being removed is folks like this little fish on the right-hand side, a brook trout, they like cool water, and we're seeing thermal or temperature degradation where the waters are warmer than what we would like to see. And ultimately, this will lead to reduced fish biodiversity. So as part of our watershed and stream diagnostic study we conducted for the farm, again, on this figure on the left, it's the Paunacussing Creek. It's the lifeline that flows through the property, and it's a tributary to the Delaware River. So it suffers from excessive flashy flows, incised banks, disconnection from floodplains, and impaired riparian buffers and resultant sedimentation issues. In the state of Pennsylvania, we have what's called the Chapter 93, which are the water quality designations of streams. And this stream is designated as a high quality cold water fishery, one designation that only 30% of the streams in the state obtain. So it's certainly one of the higher levels of designation and indicative of a stream that should have high quality habitat. With that said, there is to be established what's called a total maximum daily load, which is basically a pollution diet for the stream that was tentatively scheduled for 2029 because there are identified impairments associated with siltation and nutrient transport to the water body associated with agriculture and also stormwater runoff. So as part of our watershed and stream diagnostic study, in addition to discharge measurement, land use analysis, water quality sampling, and so forth, we also conducted what's called a geomorphometric analysis. This is where one of our stream scientists evaluate the Paunacussing through the property, and what they're looking to do is to identify certain stretches that may be impaired, identify the reasons for those impairments, and ultimately, this information is utilized to recommend restorative projects to bring those stream channels back into balance with the land. And you see here we have Reach 1 that's called out in red. It's an ephemeral headwater channel on the property. It suffered from excessive erosion and downcutting. It was not connecting to the floodplain, so every time it rained and we got heavy storms, that downcutting just became worse and worse. And also from the previous farming operation, there was really a lack of a robust riparian buffer. So this information in totality really served as some really good baseline diagnostic information. And oftentimes, in many projects, you collect some really great information, some great scientific and ecological data, and the project stops. What's really interesting with Carversville Farm Foundation as a great partner, they worked with us and we've identified grant programs to say, okay, we've identified problems and reasons for those problems. How can we translate this into action and to correct those problems? And the way we shifted from that diagnostic work to grant funding was via the Pennsylvania Growing Greener Grant Program. So what Princeton Hydro did is we worked with the Farm Foundation to identify grant programs that might allow them funding to restore the property. The Pennsylvania Growing Greener Grant is one of numerous grants in the Commonwealth, including those from DCNR, National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, Delaware Watershed Conservation Fund, and others that are available. This project aligned really well with the Growing Greener program, which was a grant program authorized in Pennsylvania in 1999 and again in 2002. And these monies are distributed to several organizations, but within the auspices of this project, we're looking at funds distributed by the Pennsylvania DEP, who puts monies towards things including watershed restoration and protection. And really, one of the focal tenets of this discussion is to really highlight the need of matching up your site and problems on your site with certain grant programs and the objectives and the focuses of those programs. For this project, Carversville Farm Foundation, we applied for and received a Growing Greener grant in 2016. And the primary focus of that grant at that time was heavily weighted towards the Susquehanna River watershed and nutrient transport to the Chesapeake Bay. But there was a portion of that grant that was specified for the Delaware River watershed. And furthermore, there was the integration, the state wanted to see integration of not only riparian barriers, but multifunctional riparian barriers, which we will discuss further with Cory's discussion a little bit later. But really, this was aligned perfectly with what we saw as a group, a lack of riparian buffers, sediment transport, stream disconnection, and some of the objectives of the grant program. So after identifying that program, it was really important for us to build support in the local community. Those are going to be organizations that show a buy-in to the idea of the project and that have faith that the project will be seen through to fruition. One of our partners that we contacted early on that was an eager supporter was the Bucks County Conservation District. And the local conservation districts, and especially in this instance, Bucks County, have been a fantastic partner, both for showing their support and also for helping to facilitate some of the different wheels that need to turn to get permits submitted and approved and so forth, so these projects really take off. Along with many of the grant projects are the need for applicants to provide some type of match. For this grant, it's a 15% match, which can be made either via cash or in-kind services, so monetized labor or work on the project. Luckily for Carversville Farm Foundation, that initial diagnostic work that they contracted with Princeton Hydro for not only served as the cookbook to develop the ideas for these projects, but also was able to be utilized as a match, for this grant submission. And Princeton Hydro wrote the grant application for the farm, reached out to a lot of the local organizations in partnership with Carversville Farm Foundation, and ultimately were successful in receiving the support and the grant funding of this Growing Greener program. So now we'll move briefly into discussion of the grant program, what it all entailed, and where we're at now. The 2016 PA Growing Greener grant for Carversville Farm not only focused on riparian restoration, but also included some really important baseline information to restore the stream channel holistically. So what this included was the engineering work, the land surveying, the engineering, hydrologic and hydraulic analysis, and the design to change the shape of that stream channel so it better integrates with the floodplain. So those floodwaters do not cause further incisement and down cutting, and also to correct that head cut that Emily had discussed earlier. So the engineering plan sets were conducted for not only reach 1, but reaches 1 through 2, and also the small wetland seep at reach 3. None of these engineering plan sets can take off into fruition without extensive permitting that Princeton Hydro conducted through our Natural Resources Department. There was also baseline monitoring to monitor baseline water quality and the populations of critical biota such as birds, salamanders, fish, and benthic macroinvertebrates. And the reason for that is we want to document the improvement in these communities as this stream is improved. And then finally, which we'll discuss later, is the demonstration project. We conducted a planting plan for the whole reaches 1, 2, and 3, but we actually implemented a portion of that plan as part of this grant project. And my colleague Emily will discuss these phases in more detail.
Okay, so the first phase of our project, we were specifically interested in repairing the riparian buffer along the Paunacussing. And as Mike had talked about previously, there are a lot of benefits to doing this kind of restoration project. It not only increases the habitat along the riparian buffer, but it also leads to water quality benefits. And our whole goal was really to turn this impaired stream over both phase 1 and phase 2 to a rich resource that was going to have a healthy ecosystem. So the first phase of that, we were interested in restoring a 300-foot section of the riparian buffer, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner. It's the southern portion of the site with a 100-foot wide riparian buffer. And then secondly, we wanted to enhance an existing emergent wetland by planting the wetland with a forested canopy. So the first, and Cory is going to go into much more detail on the plantings and the implementation of this. So I will skip over that, but okay, thank you. Phase 2 of the project, which has not been implemented yet. Phase 1 has been implemented. Phase 2 is still in the permitting phase at this point. The goal of phase 2 was really to get after the disconnection in the floodplain along this tributary and to address the head cut that was forming along the agricultural field. So here we have our site plans that have actually already been approved by DEP. On the left-hand side of the stream, this gray box going through the center is the stream corridor. And on the left-hand side, you can see some contours. Basically, that is our floodplain. We would excavate, lower the floodplain down so that the stream during heavy flows or storms can actually flow into that area and reduce some of the velocities of the stream itself, reducing the erosion and sedimentation that goes along with that. Secondly, we wanted to stabilize this head cut, which was forming on the right-hand side of the stream. And those lines that you can see on the right-hand side are, again, that's our regrading of the land. And we're basically creating a stabilized drainage swale in that area. So we already know flows are still going to continue to flow off of this agricultural field. We just want to direct them in a more shallow and stabilized manner to reduce the amount of erosion happening in that area. And thank you. This is a picture of the location. So on the right-hand side, that's where we'll be excavating to create the floodplain bench. And on the left-hand side is where we'll be creating this drainage swale. And we're also planning on installing in-stream structures, in-stream habitat, woody debris, as well as a river-sown substrate that will create in-stream habitat for aquatic life. And on top of all of that, as if that wasn't enough, we're also going to be restoring the riparian buffer in this area. So similar to phase 1, we'll be creating a 100-foot wide riparian buffer that is forested with trees, shrubs, and a permanent seed mix. And something I think is really interesting and cool about this project that Cory will go into is that the plantings will include harvestable trees that can include seeds and nuts that can be incorporated into the farm's production. And of course, we need to get permits for all this work. So the first phase of the project only required a zoning permit. It's very simple. We got that from the township. The second phase, where we're actually grading and excavating, that is more involved regulatory process. Princeton Hydro is really great at getting these restoration waivers. We've worked on numerous projects in the area and have a great relationship with the PADEP. So we were able to get a restoration waiver, which basically approves restoration activities within a stream channel. You can also get it in wetlands and in floodplains. And then we also work with the Bucks County Conservation District to review and ultimately approve an erosion and sediment control plan to ensure that our construction process doesn't degrade our stream. We're making sure our erosion controls are in place and are maintained throughout the length of our construction. And then finally, we will be obtaining township permits, grading, zoning, and floodplain development permits as well.
Thank you, Emily. The third phase of this grant-funded project, like I discussed briefly earlier, is some baseline monitoring. So to continue the documentation of the water quality and the critters that inhabit the Paunacussing. What we're looking to do is to identify a baseline of the water quality of the nutrient concentrations in the stream, of the discharge in the stream, of the fishery community, of the bird community in the adjacent riparian areas, and also of the benthic macroinvertebrate community. And like I mentioned previously, this is really important data to collect early on so we can assess, hopefully, an improvement in all of these species, in the biodiversity of the site, and in the water quality as these restorations activities progress. But certainly one of the most exciting portions of the project is this multifunctional riparian corridor, a really neat concept, different twist on the riparian buffer that our colleague Cory will discuss in detail for this next slide.
Thanks, Mike and Emily. So as Emily mentioned previously, the overall purpose of a riparian buffer is this idea of environmental benefits. But with the multifunctional riparian buffers that we're trying to implement at Carversville, it's the benefit that we're going for is to create not only these environmental benefits, but the opportunity to produce perennial crops of native nuts and fruits, as well as flowers from like woody floral trees and shrubs that can be harvested and then sold by the farm for local use, or they can use it on the farm themselves. So when designing a multifunctional riparian buffer for CFF, it was important for us to first determine what would meet their needs. Did they want to produce, nuts and fruits for commercial production? Should it be targeted towards livestock feed, personal use? What sort of wildlife implications did we want to include? And all of these factors were really important in selecting which species of trees and shrubs would work best for the farm needs. So after asking these questions, we knew that the primary agricultural purpose of the riparian buffer, or the multifunctional riparian buffer, would be used for active turkey livestock grazing, with the added future potential of harvesting, these native fruits and nuts. So knowing this, we worked with CFF to develop a plant palette focused around these intended purposes. And we had to approach this task with the knowledge that we would need to see some production in the first growing season, as Carversville, they rotate their turkey pens, and they sort of just graze through the fields. So that first season of production was really important. But we also needed to be aware that some of the species we were proposing to plant wouldn't develop a usable harvest for maybe 20 to 30 years. And so once we had our goals and objectives in place, we started on our planting plan, and we followed the zoned approach that's recommended by the DCNR. So DCNR's definition of a riparian forest buffer, or multifunctional riparian forest buffer, is one that provides opportunities for harvesting products such as nuts, berries, woody florals, forbs, and potential woody biomass, and does not permit the inputs of fertilizer or manure. And harvesting would or should not be permitted within the first 15 feet of the buffer from the edge of the stream bank. Overall, DCNR's recommended minimum width is 35 feet. Based on the site assessment and in coordination with Carversville, we established that the ideal width of the multifunctional buffer along the streams abutting their fields should be 100 feet wide and made up of 3 zones, which would allow for harvestable and grazable fruits and nuts in the outer edge of the corridor, transitioning to a naturalized deciduous buffer at the inner corridor. So zone 1 is a 40-foot wide, undisturbed area nearest to the stream bank and planted with native trees and shrubs. And the primary objectives are focused on water quality improvement and wildlife habitat. This zone, once mature, will slow stormwater runoff, reduce stream temperature, stabilize the stream bank, and provide shelter for local wildlife. Really, all of those things that Emily and Mike have been mentioning throughout the presentation. Some of the tree species that we included in this zone are silver maple, flowering dogwood, tulip poplar, swamp white oak, and pin oak. And then we used black willow live stakes along the stream bank for additional stabilization. And then some of the shrubs that we used were shadbush, red osier dogwood, winterberry, spicebush, and southern arrowwood. Zone 2 is another 40-foot wide area. It's more actively managed than the zone 1, and its primary objectives are focused on absorbing the excess nutrients from the agricultural land, degrading any kind of pesticide that might be applied, and slowing the rate of stormwater. Carversville wanted us to focus primarily on native fruit production in this zone with the future possibility of harvesting for human consumption, but also provide for turkey foraging. It is important to remember in this area, because it is an active farm, that cultivars can be used, and it's really about what meets the needs of the farm. So in this instance, it was a little bit of both. So some of the tree species that we implemented here in Zone 2 are the serviceberry, a pawpaw, shagbark hickory, eastern redbud, persimmon, American plum, and scarlet oak. And then some of the shrub species we included were things like the black chokeberry, American hazelnut, American gooseberry, common elderberry, and highbush blueberry. So rounding out the last 20 feet of the 100-foot buffer is Zone 3 and is the most active portion of the buffer. At Carversville Farm Foundation, this zone will function as the first treatment feature in the riparian buffer. Though it is actively managed and planted for immediate and high crop yields, this zone is the first to intercept nutrients and sediment runoff from any activity upslope. And this is mainly accomplished through dispersion of surface water and the promotion of infiltration. This Zone 3 is the most flexible zone, as it allows for various crop maintenance and harvesting methods. And for this zone, we really relied on Carversville to inform us on not only the best species that would meet their needs, but what would be best in terms of an arrangement for them to manage. So for this zone, we ended up selecting 2 cultivars of blackberry and 2 cultivars of raspberry. And so now I'm going to dive into the implementation of this first phase. So as previously mentioned on the planting plans, site preparation was essential. The first task was clearing zone 1, remember zone 1 being the closest to the stream, in preparation for the planting. Prior to us arriving, you know, it was heavily vegetated with your sort of typical stream hedgerow found in the area, mostly invasives and a lot of poison ivy. And to get a hard head start, you know, we got some much needed assistance from Carversville's residents goats, Jeffrey and Melvin, who you can see on the screen here. Jeffrey and Melvin had some temporary housing and a shifting pen that was moved up and down the stream corridor sort of as we needed. They would come in first, get all of the leafy material down, make it easier for us to access. And then following their lead, we moved in with some heavier equipment, cleared up some of the thicker material that Jeffrey and Melvin couldn't get to. And then we pulled invasives where it was feasible. So once we had access to the entire riparian buffer, we laid plants out and we got to work planting. So there's a number of benefits to working with a client like Carversville, one of which is the availability of equipment like bobcats that have auger attachments, makes the day go a lot faster and a lot easier. And two, because of their standing in the community and everything that they do for their neighbors, their ability to mobilize volunteer and staff is really amazing. So with some guidance from Princeton Hydro, Carversville staff moved about the buffer, drilling holes on average 8 to 10 feet on center in an irregular triangle pattern to try and mimic you know, a natural riparian buffer. So after the holes were dug, we placed the plants and backfilled, and then we also incorporated a seed mix into the plan for stabilization and pollinator value. Really, this is just meant to, it has a lot of perennial seeds in it, but the idea is that once this riparian buffer canopy, you know, matures and closes out, that these seeds will, you know, naturally broadcast elsewhere. So once the seed was applied, it was lightly raked into the soil, and then we added straw mulch for additional stabilization. Zone 1 we planted in the fall of 2009. That's the picture in the upper left-hand corner. And then zones 2 and 3 were planted in the spring of 2020, the upper right-hand. And then during the spring planting, our friendly goats from zone 1, they had started work helping us get a head start on the opposite side of the stream in preparation for future planting projects. And so here is the end result, and a picture that was taken near the end of this growing season. And you can see the resulting edge of zone 3 with the raspberries and blackberries planted in those manageable rows that I mentioned. And then additionally, you have those buffers of vegetation now on either side. It's really a great visual for the possibilities of multifunctional riparian buffers, and definitely a strategy that we will implement not only on the rest of the stream corridor in Carversville, but we hope other farms in the area.
Thank you, Cory. Like Cory mentioned, I mean, one of the primary focuses of the farm is to not only improve the land that they work, but also to serve as an educational beacon for the local community and the regional community. So they hope to showcase this project to other farmers to show them what they can do to work within the land to not only improve their farming, but also the habitat and water quality of any water courses that may be running through their farm. Moving forward, we conducted the demonstration implementation project that went off just really excellent. Big shout out to Jeffrey and Melvin, the folks at Carversville Farm Foundation, and also all of the volunteers that helped do site preparation and planting. But we have our sites, set high. We've applied for additional funding for the 2019 Growing Greener program, which is yet to be finalized, but we hope to be able to conduct some of the stream restoration with the floodplain connection and the head cut abatement along Reach 1, and to also conduct a riparian planting along the remainder of this whole stretch, Reaches 1 and 2. And then continue on working with Carversville Farm Foundation, a really great organization that I urge you all to check out. Not only because they're excellent farmers, really good folks, but their commitment to the environment and the local ecology is just really outstanding. I'll speak for myself. I had a great time presenting this project, a great time working on this project, working with a really talented group of coworkers. Emily and Cory have been integral and just amazing on this project. Steve and Stephanie and Tony at Carversville have been really great. And then also the local support from DEP and Bucks County Conservation really made this project happen. So thank you very much for listening to our presentation. And we will all be available on Wednesday, September the 23rd at 5:30 p.m. for a live question and answer session. So please join us for that session. Bring any questions or comments you may have. If you can't make the session, please feel free to reach out to us at the contact information in this slide. So again, thank you very much and hope you are all doing well.